The coastal rains of November 1995 arrived without ceremony. They did not build slowly the way the long rains did, announcing themselves over several days with a thickening of clouds and a restlessness in the birds. They simply appeared one morning, a solid, gray curtain of water dropping from the sky, as though the Indian Ocean had grown impatient and decided to reclaim the sky above the Kaya forest. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the red laterite paths of Gede had dissolved into rivers of bright, churning mud, and the baobab trees stood in the downpour like stoic, ancient elders who had seen too many storms to be impressed by this one. Inside the restored Mwenda cottage, Amina Okoro sat at her carved writing desk and stared at the letter that had arrived the previous afternoon. She had read it 11 times. She knew this because she had counted the way she always counted things that disturbed her: the cracks in the ceiling plaster, the number of seconds between lightning and thunder, and the lines of a difficult poem she could not quite understand. The letter was 2 pages long, written in a trembling but still recognizable hand, the letters formed with the deliberate care of someone who had once possessed beautiful penmanship, but whose fingers had since grown stiff with age. It had been posted from a suburb of South London called Stockwell. The envelope was made of thick, cream-colored paper that immediately distinguished it from the flimsy blue aerograms that usually arrived at the Malindi post office. She was 19 years old, the author of a celebrated debut book, the legal owner of a historic cottage in a sacred coastal forest, and she was completely terrified. The letter was from Mora Mwenda. To understand why the existence of this letter shook Amina to her very foundations, one must understand the assumption upon which the final chapter of her life's first great story had rested. When Amina had read the last entry in the leather-bound ledger, Mora Mwenda's farewell written on May 3, 1953, the quiet and broken goodbye of a widow boarding a ship for England, she had constructed, in her writer's imagination, a complete and sealed ending. Mora had sailed away. Mora had dissolved into the grey anonymity of post-war London, one more colonial-era African migrant swallowed by the vast, indifferent city. Mora had, in the gentle and merciful logic of a good story, simply ceased. The ledger was her epitaph. The volcanic hearthstone had been her last earthly act of generosity. But Mora Mwenda had not ceased. Mora Mwenda was 94 years old and living in a flat in Stockwell, and she had seen the review of Amina's book in a Kenyan cultural magazine that her niece in Nairobi sent her every 3 months. The review had mentioned the discovery of the hidden hearth vault and the leather-bound ledger. And Mora, who had spent 42 years carefully not thinking about the white cottage in the baobab grove, had sat very still for a very long time, and then she had picked up a pen. Amina set the letter down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the smooth, cool surface of the wood, the way she had once pressed her palm against the volcanic hearthstone on the afternoon she first arrived. She needed the solidity of something real beneath her hands, because the contents of those 2 pages had just rearranged the entire architecture of her understanding. Mora Mwenda had not left the cottage empty-handed in 1953. She had left something else behind, not beneath the hearthstone, which she could not bear to disturb for grief, but inside the southern wall of the structure itself, mortared into the coral rag masonry behind the carved wooden panel that framed the main window. A second cache. Not of jewelry and banknotes this time, but of documents. Legal documents. A deed, a survey map, a sworn written testimony, and a letter of correspondence from a colonial district commissioner that proved, definitively and irrefutably, that the sacred Kaya forest of Gede, 3,000 acres of ancient, spiritually protected woodland, had been fraudulently reclassified as Crown land in 1947 through the falsification of survey records to strip the local community trust of its ancestral ownership. Mora's husband, Bilal, had worked as a senior translator for the colonial administration before his conscription into the King's African Rifles. In 1946, 1 year before his final departure to Burma, he had stumbled upon the fraud during a routine audit of land registry transfers in the Malindi district office. He had understood immediately what he was looking at: a deliberate bureaucratic theft, engineered by a small ring of colonial officials and complicit local intermediaries, designed to open the Kaya forest to commercial timber extraction once the political climate of the post-war period settled. Bilal had copied the critical documents by hand, had hidden them, and had written a detailed testimony. Then he had been shipped to Burma and never returned. Mora had known about the documents. She had been too afraid to use them during the emergency years, when the colonial government was at the height of its punitive power, and a Swahili woman producing evidence of official fraud would have been silenced quickly and quietly. She had planned to act after independence in 1963, but by then her grief had calcified into a kind of permanent numbness, and she was old and far away, and the new government of independent Kenya had its own complicated relationship with the inherited colonial land records. And so the documents had remained in the wall, waiting. Now, 42 years after they had been sealed inside the coral rag masonry, Mora Mwenda needed Amina Okoro to find them. The letter ended with a sentence that Amina had read more times than any other. "My dear girl," Mora had written, "I hid the jewelry and the money because I was afraid the world would take it. But I hid the documents because I was afraid the truth would die with me. I am 94 years old. I am running out of reasons to be afraid." Amina folded the letter along its original creases and slid it carefully into the inside pocket of her canvas jacket. She looked across the room at the volcanic hearthstone, which she had replaced exactly as she had found it after emptying the vault, honoring its role as a monument to the woman who had saved her. Then she looked at the southern wall, at the wide, beautifully carved wooden window panel, whose floral and geometric patterns she had painstakingly restored with linseed oil during the refurbishment. She had admired it every single day for 14 months. She had never once considered what might be lying behind it. She stood up, walked to the window, and pressed her fingertips along the edge of the carved panel. It was fitted into the wall with traditional wooden pegs rather than modern nails, the way all Swahili joinery of that period had been constructed. She tested the pressure at the top left corner, and then the bottom right. The panel gave a fraction, the same precise, deliberate fraction that the hearthstone had given when she had first pressed on it a year ago. A familiar sensation moved up through her hands and into her chest. She was not finished here. The hearth had held one truth. The wall held another. And this second truth was louder and heavier and far more dangerous. The person Amina went to first was not Mama Fatma. This surprised her, because in all matters that frightened or confused her, Mama Fatma had been her first port in every storm since the afternoon she had arrived in Gede with 1,200 shillings and a letter cut from an old newspaper. But Mama Fatma was 71 years old, and what Amina had now was not a problem for wisdom alone. It was a problem for courage and for strategy, and for the specific kind of fierce, organized intelligence that fights a battle on multiple fronts simultaneously. The person Amina went to was Kwame Asani. Kwame was 32 years old, a Ghanaian environmental and land rights lawyer who had arrived in the Malindi area 6 months earlier as part of a regional legal advocacy network operating out of Nairobi. He had first appeared at the cooperative office asking Mama Fatma about the legal status of the community trust's forest boundaries, because he had already heard, through the murmur of the regional land rights community, about the quiet but accelerating pressure being placed on the Kaya forest. The source of that pressure had a name. Julius Omondi was a Mombasa-based property developer with significant political connections, extending all the way to several committee offices in the new parliament. He was 48 years old, wore Italian suits, and had spent the previous 18 months acquiring coastal land at a pace that alarmed conservationists and traditional community leaders in equal measure. He had tried to purchase the forest corridor from an official at the Malindi District Land Office who had, with breathtaking administrative confidence, suggested that the Kaya Trust's claim to 3,000 acres was legally ambiguous and potentially contestable under the current land registration framework. Amina had heard about Omondi the way the village hears everything, through the intricate, invisible network of evening conversations on stone verandas, of market women exchanging information across baskets of green mangoes, of elders sitting beneath the coastal trees and speaking quietly in the melodic Giriama dialect that Amina had been learning, word by careful word, for the past year. She knew that 2 members of the community trust had already received letters on official letterhead suggesting that their land use rights might need to be reviewed. She knew that the track leading to the ancient Gede ruins, a UNESCO heritage site that brought the only consistent tourist income to the village, had been quietly reclassified in some district registry as a proposed access road for development. She knew all of this, But knowing and being able to prove something are two entirely different currencies, and until the previous afternoon, Amina had possessed only the first. She found Kwame at his rented desk in the back room of the cooperative building, surrounded by topographic maps, land registry printouts, and 3 open volumes of Kenyan constitutional land law. When she laid Mora's letter in front of him and explained what it described, the lawyer sat back in his chair and was silent for a long time. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the baobab trees. "If those documents are what she says they are," Kwame said finally, his voice careful and professional, "and if they are in the condition she believes, we need to understand something clearly." He looked at Amina with the direct, unblinking gaze of someone accustomed to calibrating risk. "This is not a story about old history. The 1947 fraud, if we can prove it, would directly invalidate the reclassification that Omondi's lawyers are currently using as the legal foundation for their land contestation. The moment those documents become public, it becomes personal. Omondi has the resources to make things very difficult for individuals who stand in his way." "I know," Amina said. "Do you?" Kwame asked, not unkindly. "You are 19 years old. You have just published a beautiful book, and your life is just beginning. I want you to understand what you are choosing if you choose to lift that window panel." Amina thought of Mora Mwenda, who had copied documents by hand in a dim colonial office and hidden them in a wall before boarding a ship to a war he would not survive. She thought of Mora, alone in a South London flat at 94, who had lived long enough to pass the torch she had carried in silence for 4 decades. She thought of her own grandmother Neka, who had told her that rings possess wisdom and that certain feet are guided to certain places for reasons that are only revealed in full at the moment of arrival. "I came to Gede with 1,200 shillings, Amina said quietly. "This village gave me my life back. I think I understand what I am choosing." They removed the window panel that same evening, after the worst of the rain had passed, and the forest was filled with the clean, mineral smell of wet earth and dripping fern. Mama Fatma stood in the doorway, her arms folded and her expression grave, watching as Kwame helped Amina ease the heavy carved panel from its ancient wooden pegs. Behind it, sealed inside a shallow cavity in the coral rag wall that had been finished with a thin layer of white lime plaster, was a flat, rectangular packet wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected the hearthstone bundle. It was smaller, thinner, the shape and weight of a folder of papers rather than a box of jewelry. Amina removed it herself. Her hands did not shake this time. They were steadier than they had ever been, the hands of a woman who had spent a year building something with them, who had mixed lime mortar and cleared wild bougainvillea, and typed a manuscript on a battery-powered word processor by the light of a coastal kerosene lamp. She was not the same girl who had pressed her palm against the hearthstone with her knees trembling from a 3-day train journey and the exhaustion of having nowhere on earth to go. Inside the oilcloth were 47 pages, survey maps with handwritten annotations, a 3-page letter on official colonial government letterhead, dated September 1947, from the district commissioner of the Malindi region to an office in Nairobi, discussing the reclassification in language that was bureaucratic in its phrasing but crystal clear in its intent. And 18 pages of Mora Mwenda's testimony, written in the same precise and formal English cursive as his wife's diary, describing in methodical detail, with reference numbers, dates, the names of officials, and the specific parcels of land, exactly how the fraud had been engineered. Kwame spent 4 hours reading every page. He made notes in a small, leather-covered journal. When he was done, he looked up at Amina and Mama Fatma with an expression that was equal parts exhilaration and solemnity. "This is extraordinary," he said. "The documentation is precise, specific, and detailed enough to initiate a formal legal challenge. The names in Bilal's testimony correspond to historical figures I can cross-reference with colonial records at the National Archives in Nairobi. This is not circumstantial. This is a case." He paused, tapping the edge of the survey map. "It will take time. It will be contested at every turn by people who have significant resources. And it will require expert authentication before it can be presented to any court or tribunal." "How long?" Mama Fatma asked from the doorway. "A year. Perhaps 2. Possibly longer. Land cases in Kenya are not resolved quickly, particularly when they involve the historical record." He looked at Amina. But the momentum that a published author with a public platform can generate, the kind of public conversation that makes it very difficult for officials to quietly bury a legal challenge, that is a force multiplier that I do not have on my own. Amina understood him. She was not being asked to be a lawyer. She was being asked to be exactly what she had always been, a storyteller, a keeper of the record, a weaver of the kind of narrative that makes the invisible visible and the forgotten remembered. She thought of the words she had written in the final pages of her first book. The truest bond is not always the way of blood, but the way of recognition. She had meant it as a reflection on her relationship with Mora Mwenda across the decades. She understood now, sitting in the lamplight of the cottage with the smell of wet forest coming through the open door, that Mora had written those same words into the walls of the house itself, had literally built them into the coral rag masonry, trusting the stone to hold them until the right person arrived with the courage to look behind the carved panel. Over the following weeks, as Kwame began the painstaking legal groundwork of authentication and archival cross-referencing, Amina wrote. She sat at her desk every morning before the coastal heat gathered, and she filled pages with the story she was living. Not a creative reconstruction this time, not a literary weaving of historical threads, but something rawer and more urgent. She wrote a series of long, meticulously sourced essays describing the legal history of the Kaya Forest, the 1947 fraud, the systematic dispossession of coastal communities across the colonial era, and the dangerous modern echo of that history in the current land contestation. She was not angry in the writing because anger is an imprecise tool, and Amina was, above all else, a precise writer. She was clear. She was documented. She was exact. She sent the essays to 3 publications simultaneously: the cultural magazine in Nairobi that had reviewed her book, a legal journal that Kwame recommended, and a newly established regional newspaper based in Mombasa that had been founded by a collective of Kenyan journalists committed to investigative reporting. The response was not immediate. These things rarely are in the real world, where the wheels of public discourse turn with the slow, grinding weight of institutional inertia. But it came. A legal academic from the University of Nairobi wrote a public response validating the historical framework of the essays. The Mombasa newspaper ran a 2-part feature that named Julius Omondi directly and quoted Bilal Mwenda's testimony, with the cooperation of Kwame's legal team and the authentication of a colonial history specialist from Nairobi's National Archives. 3 members of the regional parliament, sensitive to the way the wind was shifting in the coastal constituencies where tourist and conservation interests held significant economic weight, publicly called for an independent review of the Kaya Land Registry records. Omondi's lawyers sent a strongly worded letter to the cooperative office. Mama Fatma folded it precisely in half, placed it in a manila folder, and handed it to Kwame without comment. The battle was long, exactly as Kwame had warned. There were setbacks. An initial tribunal ruling that questioned the admissibility of colonial-era handwritten testimony, which required months of additional expert authentication. There were moments of genuine fear, particularly on a night when Amina returned to the cottage to find the carved front door standing, slightly open, though nothing inside had been touched, and she understood that someone had been inside simply to let her know they could be. She sat by the hearthstone that night for a very long time, her hand resting on the cool volcanic surface, reminding herself of the woman who had sat in this same space in the shadow of a world war and hidden the truth in the walls of her home rather than let it perish. Amina did not leave. She did not close her windows or stop writing. She wrote a second book during this period. It was different from the first, less lyrical and more structural, its beauty in the architecture of its argument rather than the poetry of its prose. It was titled What the Wall Held, A History of Stolen Ground, and its dedication page read, "For Bilal Mwenda, who documented the truth before going to war, and for Mora Mwenda, who preserved it for 40 years until it found the hands that could carry it forward." The book was published in March 1997 and was immediately controversial, praised fiercely by academics, conservationists, and the coastal communities whose land history it documented, and attacked in equal measure by editorial columnists who questioned whether a 20-year-old fiction writer was qualified to make legal and historical claims of such gravity. Amina answered every criticism in writing, patiently and precisely, with the footnotes and the sourced evidence that Kwame had helped her assemble. It was the education she had never received in a university classroom, the rigorous, adversarial training of a public intellectual who must defend every sentence against the sustained challenge of people who have a great deal to lose if the sentence stands. The legal ruling, when it finally came, arrived on a Thursday morning in June of 1997, delivered to Kwame's desk by a court registry official, who handed over the sealed envelope with the carefully blank expression of a man who is trying very hard not to have an opinion about what he is delivering. Kwame called Amina from the telephone at the cooperative office. She was at her writing desk, in the middle of a paragraph. She set down her pen and walked the familiar path through the baobab grove. The community trust's land title over 3,000 acres of the Kaya forest of Gede was upheld. The 1947 reclassification was ruled fraudulent, and the supporting documentation was found to be insufficient and procedurally irregular. The land belonged to the community. It had always belonged to the community. The ruling made that plain in 32 pages of closely reasoned legal text. Mama Fatma stood in the courtyard of the cooperative office and wept with a completeness that Amina had never seen in her before, the deep, releasing weeping of someone who has been carrying a weight so long that its removal feels, at first, like falling. The village elders who had gathered in the courtyard stood around her, their faces carrying expressions that Amina tried to memorize. The specific human expression of a people to whom a stolen thing has been returned. That evening, Amina built a fire in the old hearth. It was the first time she had lit a fire in it. She had cleaned the hearthstone, polished the iron rod above it, restored the surrounding tiles, but she had not lit it, out of a reverence she had never quite articulated, some sense that the fire should not be ceremonial but functional, domestic, the fire of a life actually being lived. She had been living her life here for 3 years now. She was 21 years old. 2 books published, a legal battle won, a second community of the heart built entirely from scratch by a girl who had arrived with 1,200 shillings and no map. She sat by the fire, the leather-bound ledger of Mora Mwenda open on the desk behind her, and she wrote a letter. It was addressed to a flat in Stockwell, South London. It was 3 pages long, and it told Mora Mwenda everything. The panel removed, the documents authenticated, the ruling handed down, and the forest preserved. It told her about the baobab trees standing in the rain, and about Mama Fatma weeping in the courtyard, and about Kwame's careful, methodical intelligence, and about the village elders and their faces. It told her about the fire in the hearth, burning for the first time. At the end of the letter, Amina wrote, "You said in your last ledger entry that you prayed this house would treat whoever came next with gentleness. I want you to know that it did. It held everything you left here perfectly, the jewelry, the money, the documents, and the truth, and it gave all of it to exactly the person who needed it at exactly the right moment. A house with that kind of patience and that kind of care is not just a building. It is a living thing. I am grateful every day to live inside it. I hope you are well in Stockwell, and I hope that wherever you are, you can feel what happened here today. The forest is safe." Bilal's testimony was heard. The wall gave back what it was holding. She sealed the envelope, pressed her grandmother Neka's brass malachite ring to the wax the way she had seen done in old films, and set it beside the door to be walked to the post office in the morning. The fire in the hearth crackled steadily. The coastal night pressed warm and dark against the window. The carved door held the forest back. In the wall, the cavity behind the restored wooden panel was empty now, cleaned out and replastered, holding nothing but air and the faint, mineral memory of the old lime mortar. The hearthstone lay exactly where it had always lain, in its cradle of gray volcanic rock, smooth from generations of women kneeling upon it, the vault beneath it empty, swept clean, resting. Some stories end when the truth is found. But the deeper stories, the ones worth writing, the ones worth building a house to hold, only truly begin when the truth is finally carried into the open air, where the light can get to it, and where it can begin, at last, the slow, difficult, necessary work of healing the ground. Amina Okoro was 21 years old. She had 2 books, a restored cottage, a 3,000-acre forest, a lawyer who had become a collaborator and a friend, an old woman in London who had become a surrogate ancestor, and a brass malachite ring that had, just as its original owner promised, guided her feet to a place she had never expected. She picked up her pen. There was always, and there would always be another page to fill. Thank you for staying with Amina's story into its second chapter. Before we go, if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about fighting for what is right. And tell us in the comments, what did you think of Amina's choice? Was the risk worth it? Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.